So now we're going to talk about the 1940s, 1950s. This is usually known as what we call the parent movement. We see in the 1940s lobotomization. We're going to talk about the Kennedys for a while, and we're also going to talk about special education offered at universities. But I did want to point out in the 1950s, the name mentally deficient, which was what was used before that, is now changed to mentally retarded. Now, I do want to have a discussion before we continue on in our training. I will be saying the word retarded in this training for purposes to talk about our history. We do not use that word any longer. It is intellectually disabled or developmentally disabled. We no longer use mentally retarded or mentally challenged or mentally deficient. It is considered to be derogatory at this point, but I do have to talk about it to talk about our history. So we're going to start with lobotomies. Before the 1930s, there was a documented history of experimental surgeries on the brain to help alleviate mental health issues. Now, we kind of touched upon this in our early history, talking about trepanation, where they would open the brain and try to alleviate some of the stress on the brain, or so they thought. Now, in 1935, a doctor in Portugal, he performs a surgery called lectomotomy. It takes small pieces of the frontal lobe of the brain out of the patient. Now, Dr. Muniz, I believe is how you describe it, he was experimenting. He was trying out different ways to help somebody with a mental health condition. Dr. Walter Jackson Freeman II, we're going to call him Dr. Freeman, he actually hears of the surgery in 1935 and he's intrigued. He was the head neurologist working at George Washington University. He had experimented before that with oxygen therapy and chemical treatments. He was trying to help mentally ill patients. He wanted a new way to treat patients with mental health illness, but he was not trained ever to perform surgery. Keep that in mind. So lobotomies and Dr. Freeman. Dr. Freeman, he, like I said, was the head neurologist. He had heard of the surgery and was intrigued. He teams up with a doctor, Dr. James Watts, to perfect surgery on the brain to help alleviate patients of their mental health illnesses. So he and Dr. Watts get together and they decide that they liked what Dr. Muniz was doing and he wanted to try a different way of doing it and to perfect it. So he starts doing surgery in 1936, 1 year after Dr. Muniz's surgery in the United States. Dr. Watt and Dr. Freeman do a surgery in Kansas on a 63-year-old woman who is suffering from depression and insomnia. They drilled 6 holes into this woman's head and brain. She did survive the surgery, and it was reported that she was, quote unquote, transformed. The uprising of lobotomies around the United States starts to take over. People start to hear about it. It becomes a craze. Everybody thinks that these individuals that have mental health issues and intellectual disabilities should be fixed. So Dr. Freeman goes around the United States actually teaching other doctors how to do the surgery. And again, he doesn't have any training in surgery, but yet he's teaching doctors how to do the surgery. In the 1940s, this is when we think that there's about 5,000 surgeries done a year. So we jump from, in 1936, 1 surgery, to in the 1940s, there are said to be 5,000 a year done. Eventually, the surgery changes. Before, they weren't putting the patients under. They were just kind of going in and experimenting with drilling in the holes. Now it's changing. They start doing electroshock to render the patient unconscious. Then they insert a sharp ice pick-like object above the patient's eyeball. The instrument is then hammered into the skull, and it's wiggled back and forth to sever the connections to the prefrontal cortex. Now going back again, there is no research done or any type of, actual data to show that the prefrontal cortex should be removed from the rest of the brain or severed connections. However, Dr. Freeman believes this is going to cure patients. Lobotomies continue until 1967. So from 1936 to 1967, a lot of lobotomies are done. But Dr. Freeman was getting overzealous in his practice. He had started to let the media come and watch some of his surgeries, even the ones where patients died. The last documented lobotomization was done by Dr. Freeman in 1967 when a patient died and they finally stripped him of his practicing license. So the lasting effects of lobotomies, morbidity rate was around 14%. However, most patients were actually rendered worse off or in a vegetative state. We actually saw more worse off patients in vegetative state than we did see die. There are famous cases of lobotomies done in the United States between the 30s and 60s, and we're going to explore one of those cases on the next slide. So I told you we were going to talk about the Kennedys, and I will not disappoint you. Rosemary Kennedy is the first Kennedy that we're going to be talking about. She was born in 1918 to Joseph and Rose Kennedy. She was the sister of JFK. Her birth had complications, so it was reported that the nurse held Rosemary in the birthing canal waiting for a doctor to get there, and it was around 2 hours that Rosemary was held in the birthing canal. So she was born with an intellectual disability. She was hidden away for most of her life due to the high-profile family, homeschooled in the United States until the 1920s. She went over to England to go to a boarding school, but was removed in the 1940s due to Germany invading Paris. They became kind of worried that she was over there, so she came back over to the United States. She was sent to a convent in the 1940s, but she started getting into trouble. She was sneaking out, meeting boys, going to the bars, and the family started to become concerned because around this time, this is really where her brothers are starting to get into politics in their early years. So in 1941, Joseph and Rose decide to have Rosemary operated on. She was going to have a lobotomy by Dr. Freeman. The surgery was done on 23-year-old Rosemary Kennedy by Dr. Freeman. 2 holes were drilled into her skull, and a spatula was used to sever the link between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of her brain. Now, when they were doing the surgery, Rosemary was awake the entire time, and it is said that she was talking with the nurses, and they knew that the surgery had been finished because she stopped talking. Now, the lasting effects, Rosemary lost the ability to speak or walk after the surgery. She actually was paralyzed on her left side. She was then institutionalized for 20 years until her father had a massive stroke. At that time, Rose goes to visit Rosemary. Now, fascinating enough, Rosemary attacks Rose on the first meeting that they have. Rosemary was very frustrated, and I can only imagine, before she had the lobotomy, she did have some limitations, but the lobotomy left her even worse off. So Rose does get Rosemary out of the institution. She sees how she's being treated in the institution. She doesn't like it. She doesn't want Rosemary in there anymore. And she actually moves her into a private nursing home to live out the rest of her days. And her family members start visiting her more often. On the left is her family members visiting her while she's in the nursing home. She has a better quality of life in the nursing home. And she does die January 7th, 2005. So she did live out some of the Kennedys, actually. But Rosemary was an interesting case. A lot of people don't know about Rosemary, but there are really cool books and documentaries about Rosemary. So I encourage you to do more learning and to get more information about the family. But Rosemary was one of the first Kennedys we were going to go over today. Now we're going to start talking about the parent movement. Like I said, the 1940s into the 1950s is known as the parent movement, and that's because it really started with the first parent conference, which was held in Minnesota. 90 people came, and it started a new movement of parents and friends of individuals that had an intellectual disability wanting better care and treatment. Civil lawsuits are being filed in all of the United States for civil rights violations of individuals with an intellectual disability. And in 1953, the ARC, that's what we call it now, formerly called the National Association for Retarded Children, was founded by these parents and friends.